And its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused Defence Minister Benny Gantz of violating the coalition agreements as lawmakers voted on a bill to dissolve the parliament and hold the country's fourth election, that too in 2 years. Gantz supported the opposition-backed bill, which has cleared its first hurdle in the parliament. However, the bill will require several readings before becoming a law. Gantz, who is Israel's alternate prime minister, said that Netanyahu's refusal to approve the budget proposals showed that he wanted to take Israel back to polls. Netanyahu hit back at Gantz, saying that the country needed a coronavirus vaccine, not an election.
בימים דרמטיים כאלה לא צריך ללכת לבחירות. עם ישראל רוצה אחדות ולא קלפיות. הוא רוצה חיסונים ולא תשדירי בחירות. בני גנץ צריך להרים את ההנדברקס. הוא צריך לעצור את ההידרדרות לבחירות. הוא צריך להפסיק את ההתקפות משולחות הרסן האלה. צריך להתנהג אחרת. זה עוד לא מאוחר מדי.
The coalition government, which was only formed after 3 bitterly fought elections between Netanyahu and Gantz, failed to produce a clear winner, has now been plagued by infighting from the very beginning. Let's quickly get in a sense of perspective on these developments, and for that I'm joined in by international affairs expert Jody Cohen, who's joining me live from Ranana in Israel. Thank you, Jody, for joining our broadcast today. Now that the preliminary proposal to dissolve the parliament has been passed by Israeli legislators, what explains this collapse of the alliance, first of all, and what happens next?
This is like an elaborate game of chess, and we really don't know which way the key players will move. And the key players being obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu and alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz. They went into a coalition agreement together 6 months ago, and as you said, we've had 3 elections in the past year and a half. We're looking at potentially at a 4th election within a space of 2 years. And the key issue right now is whether or not a budget will be passed. A budget hasn't been passed for 2020 or 2021, which was a key part of the coalition agreement. And that is the reason that Gantz is now supporting these calls for an election. The question really isn't, will there be an election? The question is really one of timing. And there are various scenarios that can be played out, which is why I refer to it as a game of chess, although obviously these are very serious times. The first scenario that could happen is that there is no budget passed by the deadline of the 23rd of December, which means that there'll be an election in March.
Right.
Another scenario is that a budget does pass and that Benny Gantz supports the coalition agreement with the hope of him becoming Prime Minister in November 2021. And this is key because if a budget isn't passed, then Bibi Netanyahu has a sort of a get-out clause of the coalition agreement and could call himself for an election. The question of timing is key because Netanyahu will want an election further towards the summer and not in March, perhaps around June, when COVID-19 vaccines are expected to have been rolled out across Israel. And then the election results could be very different to perhaps if an election is called today.
Right, Jody, and yet the reports indicate that Gantz and Netanyahu are expected to continue negotiations in a last-ditch effort to preserve their troubled alliance. What will these negotiations hinge on?
So the first issue will be one of whether or not a budget is passed, and Gantz has called for that to be a priority because there's obviously huge medical, economic and social implications of this coronavirus pandemic, which is affecting everybody. So that will be the key issue. Another one is one of trust, because the agreement means that Benny Gantz should be taking over the rotation of Prime Minister in November. Whether or not that happens remains to be seen. A poll by Panel Politics showed that if an election was held, and obviously we can't fully rely on polls, we know from past experience that they don't always show what will be, but does show that if an election is held now, Bibi Netanyahu would be the winner with 29 seats, and he would be able to form a coalition of 67 out of 120 of the seats, so a comfortable coalition. But there are other winners that could come out of this. There's Naftali Bennett and the Yamina faction. They're polling in second place at 23 seats. And that could see Naftali Bennett either being the kingmaker for Bibi or potentially even for the first time being a contender for Prime Minister himself. There also remains to be seen if new parties will come into play. That often happens. Israel is known as a startup nation. The culture is creating new things. So often we see new parties come into play before an election. But what is clear, and although this is still uncertain times, we don't know if an election will happen, or rather when an election will happen. It is people do feel that this is a sign of a strong democracy. The fact that there have been protests against the Prime Minister, that those have stopped throughout the coronavirus restrictions, and that elections are held, obviously this is the fourth one in 2 years, so they're held on a regular basis, is a sign of a strong functioning democracy.
Right. Jody, just at the time when this unity alliance was being formed, Israel was going through massive lows, and that also includes the coronavirus crisis. But what explains the collapse of this alliance now?
So the collapse of the alliance now is really the question of the budget and whether or not alternate Prime Minister Gantz will get that opportunity to take over as being Prime Minister come November 2021. Prime Minister Netanyahu would obviously like to continue being in power. He believes that there are policy differences between the parties, ideological differences. He believes that his vision is the right way, and he would like to see himself continue as Prime Minister, and obviously Benny Gantz would like to see himself have the opportunity to take over as Prime Minister in November. So that's the underlying issue. The sort of policy issue is one of the budget.
All right, and of course December 23rd is going to be a very crucial day which will decide the fate of this alliance as well. Let's see if the budget is passed or not in December. Having said that, thank you so much, Jody, for bringing us all those inputs.